Our presentation tonight is entitled The William Morgan Affair, the Incident and Its Consequences. In the years following the Revolutionary War, the state of New York became a contrast of cultures. The eastern half of the state was enjoying economic prosperity. New York City was fast becoming the largest city and cultural center for this new nation. Also, the area referred to as upstate or up the Hudson River to Albany was certainly flourishing. The western part of New York, the area west of the Catskills and the Adirondack mountain range, is the area we're talking about, and it was just the opposite. It was largely an agricultural-based economy, and it was suffering. The people, mostly uneducated, were poor and superstitious. They were religiously inclined, but a parade of evangelists through the years had seemed to get them all mixed up. No less than 5 religious groups were started in this area of western New York during these days, including the Mormon sect. Masonry was also well received by this group, this area, and it had grown rapidly. Back in 2010, when I did a presentation on the northern and the southern jurisdictions of the Scottish Rite and their beginnings, you may recall that the area we now call the northern jurisdiction was in disarray during these years, as there were 2 supreme councils competing against each other, the Bid-Adid group and the Cyrano group. The infighting was quite ruthless, which made for a bad view of Masonry by the general public. So, this is a quick look at the landscape of western New York State in the 1820s. It was fertile ground for unrest, religious, political, and fraternal. The principal character of our story tonight is William Morgan. Let's take a look at this character, William Morgan. He was born in Culpeper County, Virginia in 1774. He worked as an apprentice stonemason and followed that trade when and where the work was available. He paid more attention to the bottle than he did to his trade, and he and his family were always needy and seeking help from others. At the age of 51, he arrived in Batavia, New York. That was the year of 1825. He claimed to be a master mason, and he signed a petition requesting membership in the Royal Arch chapter. Unfortunately, he was initiated in that area of York Rite Masonry. Now, no records have ever been found showing that he had received the Blue Lodge degrees. And now, proper records were not always kept, and many were destroyed by fire back in those days, so that's not that unusual a situation. But this is still somewhat of a mystery. Morgan, shortly thereafter, Morgan had joined with a couple of other men, non-Masons, and purchased a printing press. He seemingly already had a plan in mind to make money. As mentioned, he became a Royal Arch Mason in May of 1825 in a small city about 20 miles from Batavia named Leroy, New York. Shortly thereafter, the Royal Arch Masons who lived in Batavia petitioned requesting a Royal Arch chapter be established in their city. Unpopular with some of the Batavia Masons, Morgan was irritated by the removal of his name from that petition, and also because he was denied employment on the construction of a new Masonic temple in that general area. Now, most people believe that he was motivated by more than revenge for these slights, even though he did receive some of these slights from the fraternity. He was wanting to make big bucks from printing and selling the secrets of Masonry. A fire in the printing shop was blamed on the Masons. It did minimal damage. Morgan was then arrested for a debt and was jailed in Canandaigua, New York, in September of that year. The next day, 4 Masons appeared at the jail, discharged his debt, and escorted Morgan to an awaiting carriage. What happened to Morgan following his abduction remains an unsolved mystery to this day, 190 years later. No trace of his corpse was ever found. Some 69 Masons involved in his removal, either in the action or knew about it, told this story. Supposedly, they had arranged with Canadian brothers to set him up on a farm in Ontario, where he would quietly remain for the rest of his life. Basically, they were going to give him a new life, a new identity, kind of like the federal witness protection program used in the infiltrating crime syndicates of later years. Anyway, this was supposedly their plan. Something went wrong. There was courtroom speculation that he was bound with weights and thrown in the Niagara River below the falls. Now, this was 1825, so in the next 5 years, listen to this, 20 grand juries were called. 54 Masons were indicted. 39 were brought to trial. Of those, 10 received convictions and jail terms of from 30 days to 28 months was the longest. The convictions were not for murder, but for abduction. Of the 10 Masons convicted, only 6 actually participated in Morgan's removal. The whole affair was done, of course, to forestall the publication of a book called Illustrations of Masonry, which was the expose, supposedly going to be the expose on Masonic secrets. Now, to their embarrassment, the Masons' embarrassment, this book was actually published 3 months after Morgan's disappearance. So really, they didn't accomplish anything. The book was already underway, evidently. What is amazing is that neither group, Morgan and his printer friends on one side and the local Masons on the other, neither group were aware that some 30 Masonic exposés had previously been published in English since 1723. So this was not going to be something that was going to be great like they thought. What a shame. The printers made no money, and the Masons created a national scandal. The American public was shocked by the charges that Morgan was supposedly murdered by Masons. Newspaper articles screamed that the jurors were all Masons. The law enforcement officers were all Masons. The local newspapers were quite silent, as they were Masons. No wonder major penalties were not passed out, so they said. They charged that Masons had more allegiance to their fraternity than to the law of the land. In the decade after William Morgan's abduction, actually the period was more like 1826 to 1842, anti-Masonic sentiment raged like a brush fire, spreading into politics and giving birth to a third political party, the Anti-Masonic or Anti-Masonry Party. Now, this was the first third party in American political history. Previous to this, we either had just the one or two applying against each other. This was the third. Let me expand for just a moment on the political parties in the United States. Originally, there was just the Federalist Party, which really was just a group surrounding the original power structure of George Washington. Thereafter came the Democratic Republican Party, sometimes referred to as the Jeffersonian Party. In the 1820s, this Democratic Republican Party had evolved into what we now know as the Democratic Party. and the Whig Party had appeared on the scene, representing people with contrasting view of politics. Now, this was the political climate when the Anti-Masonic Party appeared after the Morgan incident drew nationwide attention. An intriguing side note, the new political party was the first party, this new Anti-Masonry Party was the first party to employ a nominating convention for the selection of a presidential candidate. The other two major parties, of course, in succeeding years, promptly followed their example. And of course now, the nominating convention process is just a standard procedure in our political world. The presidential election of 1832 was the Anti-Masonic Party's first presidential campaign. The candidate was a former Attorney General from the state of Maryland named William Wirt, W-I-R-T, Wirt. He was the candidate for the Anti-Masonry Party. Another interesting side note, listen to this, he ran against two other people, of course, two other parties. He ran against Henry Clay, a former Grand Master from Kentucky, and also against incumbent President Andrew Jackson, a former Grand Master from Tennessee. So the presidential election of 1832 was really centered around Masonry. You had two former Grand Masters, and then the Anti-Masonic Party had formed and was active. Even though the Anti-Masonry Party died out after the 1836 election, which was the next one down the line, it left its mark on the country, particularly in the northern and middle Atlantic states. Since the beginning of Masonry, this fraternity has had its critics and enemies. So the demise of the Anti-Masonry political party and movement did not mean the end of anti-Masonry sentiment in the United States. It was with us before, and it's still present today. In this instance, anti-Masonry failed as a political movement, but succeeded as a social movement. Masons were not held in high regard there for a few years. Many churches actually banned Masons. If you're a Mason, you couldn't join that particular denomination. Masonic membership took a hit. The state of New York went from, listen to this, the state of New York went from 480 lodges in 1826 to 75 lodges in 1835. Massachusetts dropped from 108 to 56 lodges. And the Grand Lodge of Vermont actually went out of existence because they didn't have any lodges that were active. The low point in membership then came in the year 1840, after which the fraternity slowly regained its numbers and prominence, but it was slow. This all occurred because a group of Masons with supposedly good intentions of protecting their beloved fraternity went too far. They stepped over the line of right and wrong. Perhaps we can look upon this era of national upheaval against Masonry in another perspective, which I think was actually positive. It pushed Masonry into the private life sector and somewhat away from the political scene. If Masonry had continued to grow at the rate that it had just previous to this incident, it would have probably gone into a national political power. And if that would have happened, you know what would have happened to our fraternity. Corruption would have set in and our core values would probably have suffered. Even 100 years later, in the huge Masonic membership explosion of 1900 to 1925, we've kept an arm's length with politics. After researching this subject, I made two personal observations. These are Tom's observations, not some learned Masonic scholar. So take them as you will. The first one, all Masonic bodies in all their activities, basic Masonry plus all the higher degrees, shrine included, must make sure that they do not cross the line of breaking the law, regardless of what the minor laws, major laws, or whatever, because we are still vulnerable to public opinion. Secondly, when we are attacked by outsiders, whether they have good cause or are saying untruths, we must try to set the record straight in a low-key manner and not return fire with fire. So this has been a look at the William Morgan affair and its aftermath. A major mistake by a few that affected many.